Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about more news on the Canadian reaction, showing again what a mistake Trump has made. Our guest for the show is Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hi, Jay. Weather's nice in Canada.
Just to set the stage, Canada has been our best neighbor, ally, and trading partner over these many, many years. Tragically, that is now all still history, thanks to Trump. And Canada now needs to act in its own interest, whether or not that pleases Trump or the US. So let me ask you, what did you think about the parade and about the No Kings protests this past weekend?
Well, the No Kings protest got an awful lot of coverage in Canada, whereas the the big parade didn't get much at all. And it was almost like, treated as if it was a totally unnecessary waste of money. And, there was far more coverage on the shooting in Minnesota than there was on the parade.
Yeah, I think generally the parade was a failure. Nobody showed up, but it was also a lackluster parade anyway. The soldiers that marched really didn't seem very inspired. And my favorite part of it was the tanks. The tanks had squeaks. So I don't know if you saw this, but you couldn't hear the crowd, yelling at him or applauding him because there wasn't a crowd. But you could hear the tanks with the squeaks. And I almost think that the guys who were maintaining the tanks wanted to have those squeaks because they all squeaked. It was not an impressive parade.
Perhaps you've seen less tanks moving than I have, despite the fact that I'm from Canada and we don't have too many tanks. Is tanks always squeak? At least the ones that we have always squeak. Doesn't matter where you're running them.
Well, let's talk about the G7 meeting. He's up there, he's making speeches, he's fixated on his regular agenda. But is anybody taking him seriously?
I think all of the leaders are there, to do, normal G7 business, but the tariff mess is going to dominate in the backgrounds in the one-on-one meetings. And I think, the Canadian slant's kind of interesting as to, since Canada's the host, Mark Carney gets quite a bit of flexibility as to who he can invite. And he invited Modi, the, head of India, and the gal, the president in Mexico. Neither of which, the press here thought it was really not too good to invite Modi, because there were a couple of assassinations in Canada, which the Canadian police were fairly quickly able to point that it had Indian government support. But nevertheless, India is now the most populous country in the world. It had historically, British connections. It's still a member of the British Commonwealth, and Canada and India would have a lot of reasons why they could increase the trade between them. So I thought, it was a pretty clever move. Certainly with the population of India, it carries some weight, and the counter group that the BRIC bunch, having got India to come into that, it's important that the nations of the world try not to have that BRIC group take over.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that he invited India, but not Pakistan. There's a statement there. They're essentially at war. They have
Pakistan really is a pretty insignificant economy. Their population is big, but it's like Nigeria. the similar, those 225 million people in Brazil, they count in terms of Canadian economic relations, where Pakistan doesn't exist in terms of, you know, trading relations.
I also thought it was a good idea for him not to invite Putin, but Donald Trump made a speech not too long ago saying that Mark Carney's failure to invite Putin was a mistake. How do you feel? How do the Canadian people feel about not inviting Putin?
Remember, Trump always liked to have sort of G8, not G7, and the number 8 was Russia, and I thought that was a total mistake, and Canadians certainly consider Russia to be the enemy, even worse than they think of China.
It's amazing. I mean, I would have expected that. I would have expected that Canada and the Canadian people would be opposed to having Putin there. But Trump gets up and he makes a speech saying that Mark Carney made a mistake by not inviting him. I think that shows you where Trump's sensibilities are. But he's all alone on that, especially when he's visiting Canada. So let's talk about the Trump's Golden Dome project, because in order to do the Golden Dome, like the Israeli Iron Dome, you have to have cooperation of the jurisdictions under where the dome operates. What's the situation on the Golden Dome, and how much does the U.S. need to have cooperation by Canada?
There's no information out really about the Golden Dome other than what Trump has blithered into the news lately. But if you think of the, Israeli Iron Dome, and the rockets are coming into Israel normally from the east, well, unless you've got that dome protecting to the east of the Israeli borders, it doesn't make much sense. So that if you're anticipating, you know, uh, ballistic missiles coming from, let's call it Moscow, well, how are they going to hit the United States? Well, they're either going to go over Greenland or over Canada to get there. Now, if you start at the other end of Russia in like Vladivostok, if Americans know where that is, it's just north of Japan on in Russia, big city there, military city. If the rockets are coming from, or the intercontinental ballistic missiles are being fired from there, then they're going to go over Alaska and Canada to get to, Seattle or Washington. So really, with those missiles, you need to detect that they're coming long before they're going to reach the 49th parallel or the border between Canada and the United States. The technology on the ground that can anticipate and determine where missiles are coming from and where they're coming so that you can then put your counter measures into play, that has to be in, northern Canada and northern Greenland, or, because nowadays those missiles are coming so fast that, like especially the intercontinental ballistic ones, how far ahead do you have to be able to detect they're coming in order that there is enough time for a response? So that there realistically couldn't be a shield to protect the U.S. unless it included, a reasonable distance north of the U.S. border for those detection devices. Now, the dumbest thing Trump has said in regard to the Golden Dome is, Canada should pay for, a huge percentage of it. Well, really, that doesn't make any sense economically for Canada. Even though the dome might be protecting, cities in the southern part of Canada, not much like Toronto would be just as safe as Cleveland, and Vancouver would be just as safe as Seattle. but Winnipeg might be as safe as Minneapolis if got your coverage. However, really, Canada wouldn't consider the same value of having the dome because, if the United States wants to declare war against Canada, you know, what great chance does Canada have with 1/10 the population and a very small military force compared to the US? It's if you think of Ukraine as the same population as Canada, and Russia, but only with about a third the population or military strength, maybe a quarter of the military strength of the United States. Um, Ukraine's done an admirable job defending itself only with the help of, you know, a major number of nations. Where if Canada were standing by itself fighting somebody, Canada really doesn't have a great chance, other than it could get beat up by Russia or beat up by China or beat up by the United States, just its sheer population and military ability comparatively.
Let's talk about the tariffs and how Mark Carney is responding to them, what countermeasures and adjustments he's making to preserve the Canadian economy, and how successful his adjustments and countermeasures have been. And I suppose part of that is this coming up at the G7 meeting, or is Trump dominating the conversation with whether Putin should have been invited?
I don't think that'll dominate the G7, although Trump can disrupt the agenda at any time he feels like it. But really, when you think about counter moves, there are some of them that come immediately to mind. As you may or may not know, or your listeners, the recent election in Canada, Mark Carney was just barely been the prime minister, and the very first legislation that he has proposed to Parliament was quite different. He had 3 bills sent to Parliament. One was called the Strong Borders Act, which one could just tell by the title that was designed to appease Donald Trump, irrespective of what was in the bill. Just the title by its nature, but a lot of it was strong borders to protect Canada from the United States. An awful lot of that aspect, but you can, a title, one might remember that Donald Trump doesn't read very fast, and nor does he want to read the whole story, so the title would probably be enough. But there's in addition to the 3 bills, there's a fourth action, but the 3 bills by themselves show the importance. One was the second bill was titled "Making Life More Affordable for the Canadians Act," and this included as an important item an income tax deduction. And much like the U.S., you have your tax goes in rates, and they're little rate brackets. Well, the lowest bracket in Canada used to have a 15% rate. If any money that you earned that hit that bracket was taxed at 15%, and that was cut to 14%. Now, the public and the press immediately thought, oh, gee, if you're lowering the rate at the lowest tax bracket, what a wonderful deal for all the poor people, like the lower earners, where, it doesn't take too much to recognize that how many of those people even earn enough to get out of that bracket? So they just have a little bit of their income upon which they're paying a reduced rate, where the very wealthy guy, he has a huge amount, like what all of the money that is covered by that bracket gets a reduction. So they get a big saving. So a very clever move by Carney, got a tax deduction for everybody, and the wealthy were the ones that were capable to recognize that they got more than the little guy, but the little guys believed that it was for them. And so let's just let it ride that way. A clever politician, very clever political move. Now, that comes relevant later, because if you reduce 1% on the tax rate, that's an awful lot of money, for a government. So somebody would say, wow, you're going to have a big deficit. Well, anyhow, his third act was the One Canadian Economy Act. Nice titles they have. So that one was really designed for internal trade barriers within Canada, and a bunch of things that would greatly increase the economy of Canada, and do it pretty quickly. Now, there was another item that he just happened to do. He just made an announcement and said, oh, Canada will meet its NATO defense requirement of 2% of GDP this calendar year, where the day before, Canada was the biggest laggard in all of the NATO, or maybe it was close to it. There might be some teeny weeny country that has less, but Canada had about 1.3% of GDP for defense. And so this 2% this year, you'd have, wow, that's going to be a humongous amount of government expenditure. So where are they going to get the money from? Are we going to have a horrendous tax increase? Or are we going to eliminate a ton of all good social programs or some other government expenditure? Well, you have to remember that Carney is a professional economist. And to understand that is really, really simple. Is Canada could just simply increase its debt. Like he gave a tax deduction, plus increase the expenditures dramatically. And there's a whole bunch more, like all of those, 3 acts that are already involve extra government expenditure. So it's useful to understand where Canada stands in terms of its public debt. The 2 previous governments in Canada, going back 15 years ago, and it was started by a guy named Stephen Harper, but Justin Trudeau continued the idea of continually pointing to how the debt around the world, the governments are way too much debt. And they never really circled in on where does Canada stand. It was more like, wow, all these governments, the US, wow, look at they just have these budget deficits year after year, and so we've got to be really careful. We can't go down the sewer. And you notice how I just jumped from them to we. And so there was the image created for the Canadian public that the Canadian government is already spending too much, don't ask for any more. Like that was the idea. Well, in fact, Canada's debt, and you got to take government debt. And so if you took the debt in the United States and you said, well, gee, the federal government owes X trillion, but if the Federal Reserve holds half of it, well, you can't count that half. If the debt is held by just a government agency, such one that gives out Social Security, and they just have a whole bunch of the government debt, well, that's internal, so you should wipe it out. So what you really have is what I would call the net debt. Don't allow government agency debt. Well, Canada's net debt, if you counted all 3 levels of government, is only a little under 14% of Canada's GDP, where the United States is about equal to its GDP. So you can say, well, gee, you got 1/7 as much. Now, the United States everybody in the US screams about how the debt is way out of line and very unreasonable. Well, it's the US net debt is about the same as Britain and the same as France. If you're to pick the G7 players, Canada and Germany is halfway in between, Canada and the US in terms of its stuff, or it's about 3 times the debt level Canada has. So Mark Carney's on pretty good grounds to A, give a tax cut, B, say we'll meet our NATO spending this year, and thirdly, we have these 3 bills and more to come that we're going to spend an awful lot of government money to help Canada mitigate Donald Trump's tariffs and the uncertainty. I think the uncertainty created by Trump has probably caused more harm in Canada than just the tariffs. That is, major players have been unwilling to invest until the air gets clearer as to what is happening. And parallel to that is the housing market. The day Trump took office, the housing market in Canada was booming. Prices were going up. Everybody was expecting them to keep going up, and today all the way across Canada, the housing market's soft.
Well, that's better for people who want to leave the U.S. and buy a residence in Canada, isn't it? So that's a happy thought. But you described these elements of Mark Carney's agenda, and all of those elements exist in the big, beautiful bill. Tax cut, more defense spending, more borrowing, all of that. And I know there are other elements too, but is Mark Carney trying to emulate what Trump is doing? Is he doing this for the benefit of Canada, or to show Trump that he's kind of sympathetic to what Trump is trying to do?
Oh, I don't think he's sympathetic to what Trump's trying to do at all. I think they're more defensive, but also what is the most he can do, and particularly how quickly can the effect be to improve the Canadian economy. Not only, but primarily because the actions Trump has taken with the tariffs and creating uncertainty have given him the opportunity to do very radical things very differently. For example, I didn't indicate an item with regard to these 3 great big bills that Carney put before Parliament. The Parliament in Canada is based on the one in the United Kingdom and essentially the same as exists in, say, Australia, where differently than the United States, in the United States, the Trump era has shown a continuation of past things that Congress doesn't amount to much. That is, the White House decides everything. And all of the legislation that goes into Congress are parts of what I call an omnibus bill. I think that's the phrase they use in the US, where there's everything in the kitchen sink that you can throw into a bill is in there, so the title to the bill and the stray parts that are in it never ever get the genuine input of the people that the nation is voted in to decide. Like some guy in Oregon votes for a congressman, and they go to Washington, but they have no vote at all, really. Especially in the Trump era. Now, for the first time that I can recall, those 3 bills that I mentioned all 3 of them are omnibus type bills. They include some other garbage in there, not the same as the title. That's very unique. Now, if you remember, Mark Carney, historically, he was an executive in the United States, handling big scale money for corporations and understood U.S. government very well. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada, which is the same as being the head of the Federal Reserve in the US. And he was also the governor of the Bank of England. So he's got some pretty good international knowledge of what kind of legislation that government sticks in and how do you get it through. Well, it's pretty unique in Canada to not have the parliamentarians have their say. That is, the parliament in Canada has always had a much bigger role in what happens in Canada than has had the regular congressman in Congress, for many years. And and so, that's an unusual feature for Carney, or one that raises my eyebrow, because I happen to like the system. If you looked at how many bills um, or how many days did Parliament sit in the United Kingdom, and what did they do? And they take, you know, every what you'd call an omnibus bill in the United States. Well, if there were 10 different parts in it, there would be 10 bills in England or in the United Kingdom, and every one of them would go through a pretty rigorous process in the British Parliament. The Canadian one is not quite as good in that regard as the British one, but it's a heck of a lot better than the use of the U.S. congressman. They are almost there for a vacation rather than doing much.
Is Mark Carney learning about this from Trump? Because these omnibus bills you're talking about really do sound like the structure of the big beautiful bill.
The jury's still out. Okay, there is no way that Mark Carney has dreams of dictatorship.
No, I'm not talking about that.
No,
I'm
no,
talking
but
about
I'm
whether
saying
he is jamming all kinds of other issues in those bills in order to get them through without resistance by Parliament.
well, let me take a couple of points on that. The first thing, the three bills kind of show that Carney has little or no concern for, number one, political ideology. Now, we just got out of an election, and yet these three bills, many parts of those bills are the very ideas proposed by the opposition party in the election a couple months ago. Anything that was good in his mind is in there. And anything they electioneered on that he didn't like is not in there. I like that. Okay. But it sure makes it easy to get it through Parliament, even if it is part of an omnibus bill. Now, that's a personal opinion, but because there's not been much press on that. Parliament in Canada is supposed to be able to look at each item separately, don't have any of this omnibus crap, which is the norm in the US. Now, the other thing, though, that Carney shows he's really got little or no concern for is election promises. Now, we mentioned the Golden Dome thing before. Well, during the election, it was like, when the U.S. is talking about 51st state or Trump is and that sort of stuff, anything to do with the U.S. is just no way. Canada's not going to cooperate with the U.S. We're looking everywhere else. And so when Carney says, "Oh, Donald, you have a wonderful idea, this Golden Dome, that should be great," because he knew it was a pet thing for Trump. You got to smooch up a little bit. There's no real commitment whatsoever yet. Okay. But just by coming out publicly and saying, rah, rah, for Golden Dome sounds like a wonderful idea, or whatever Trump would keep him happy or get him all excited. He got an awful lot of negative press in Canada about that. Is how could you possibly talk about Golden Dome with a rotten slob that lives next door that's extorting us at this very moment? Um, so there was a lot of negative press. With Carney just kind of gives it the, hit brush off the shoulder and go. And another aspect of, what these three bills showed, and I kind of mentioned, was that he doesn't have an aversion to deficits. And you think of somebody who, if you took the Federal Reserve chairman and Jerome Powell right now and said he didn't give a hoot about government deficits, you'd say, you got to be kidding. How could somebody that's been a dominant central banker not worry about deficits? Well, really, it's because Canada's status quo debt position is so below everybody else's in terms of risk or exposure that there's no great risk to Canada dealing with that. So really, you could kind of summarize his reaction to all of this is if you were a first year economics student, you always had in one of the first couple of lectures, government has to have a choice, guns or butter. Well, Canada can do both. Canada can have guns and butter. Carney knows it, and Carney's using it.
Let me go to the last question I wanted to ask you, and that is there's been some press about whether Canada should shut down access from the lower 48 states to Alaska. It has a tremendous amount of control on transportation, on the roads that are Canadian, on the airspace that's over Canada, that's Canadian, and on the inter passage sea lanes, where a lot of ocean traffic gets from the 48 states to Alaska. Now, nobody is saying that Canada should shut it all down, but Canada could charge tolls. Canada could limit or restrict, transportation on one or the other of those methods of, areas of transportation. Is there any discussion about it? What do you think about it?
I kind of smiled when you started to say that because it made the news the other day as if Canada had shut off the Alaska highway. Now, you said roads plural. There's only one. There's only one road that goes anywhere near from Canada to Alaska of any length. And I mean, it's got to go through 500 miles from nowhere to somewhere of lesser importance. That the all of the traffic to Alaska was stopped. See, and that made the news as if that was a political move. Well, it was because there were some humongous forest fires and you couldn't go on the road. But the press enjoyed making some kind of story as if that was some intentional political move. Really, there are Canadian mines that have offshoots from that Alaska highway. There are, oil and gas facilities that use that highway. Canada has one of our northern territories, the Yukon, which is next to Alaska, above the 60th parallel in latitude. And it's, let's say the city of Anchorage alone has about 250,000 people, I think. And that's way, way more than all of Canada north of the, not much further north than Edmonton. There's no, like all of the three northern territories in Canada, which comprise about a third of Canada's total area geographically, have less than 100,000 people. Where Anchorage alone has about 250. So but the Anchorage is on the coast, and the weather in Anchorage is not the same as it is 100 miles inland. You just cross the coast range or the mountains and you're dealing with Siberia type weather. It's not the same as on the coast. Anchorage isn't, a heck of a lot different than Seattle in most of its weather.
Is this a possibility? I mean, if things get more tense, you think the government will restrict travel in these three areas of travel?
I doubt very much. What would common sense be rather than any anti-American anything? So I don't foresee any major restriction on anything going north. And very importantly, with Alaska versus Alaska Highway or Inside Passage, those are all the things that affect only one Canadian province, really, the one on the Pacific coast, British Columbia.
Okay, Ken, we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. I know there's much more to discuss. Thank you so much to our special guest, Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of View from the North. We've been discussing more news, more issues on the Canadian reaction to Trump's agenda. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.